I want to move on to something that really got my pip. Victoria's 5-day lockdown. It's over, right? It's over today. The Premier today claimed, and I quote, "It worked." Now, Rowan, in my opinion, this 5-day lockdown of the entire state of Victoria, 6.5 million people, for 5 days, this worked only in the way that you could say, well, if they'd also held a smoking ceremony at the start, or if they'd sacrificed an animal, cut its throat and sprinkled blood over the grass, that would have worked too, because it worked in exactly the same way. It added to the theatre, made no difference.
Exactly. Well, you're right, and maybe they could have taken some Cook's cabbages off rooftops and done that as well, because that's obviously a miracle cure. Here we have this is the problem with the whole lockdown thing is the double negative, because if you lock it down and people carry on dying, getting infected and dying, as during the first two lengthy lockdowns, or certainly one of them in Victoria, the second one. Then you go, well, we've got to keep the lockdown going because, it's working. So it's working because we've got to keep it going. But if nobody is ill and nobody dies, then the lockdown worked. So either way, the lockdown works. Whereas, in fact, there is no evidence from anywhere around the world that lockdowns do work. There's no evidence where we can say that group of people who were locked down did better than that group of people who weren't locked down. And so this is the whole fraudulent aspect of the lockdown. And the problem is, or it would now appear, and we will have the data in future years to look back and go precisely what did occur and what worked and what didn't work, but it would appear that the single greatest thing that worked for Australia was shutting the international borders. And the only problem was we didn't do it efficiently enough. All the internal lockdowns, all the closed internal borders, all the forced enclosures of people's small businesses, all of that stuff was probably completely, and I hate to say this because a lot of people have lost their livelihoods, but completely pointless.
Rowan, I'm prepared to back a lockdown in extremis. If the virus is going rampant, if every measure is needed to try to stop transmission, yes. But my point here is that, to me, there is no evidence that contact tracing didn't do the job and couldn't do the job on its own, because you had one guard getting sick, 16 people infected immediately after. They're all quite normal, natural people you'd suspect, close contacts, relatives, housemates of the relatives, bang, 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 traced, isolated very quickly, many days ago, last week, as I understand, but days ago, not roaming around, they're isolated, yet the state is in lockdown for 5 days, and the government doesn't say, well, if it hadn't been for the lockdown, this or that person, they'd be out there spreading the virus. And that's my point. These are measures that were taken, that were effective. The lockdown was incidental, and we saw exactly the same with the Brisbane lockdown, a cleaner and a partner, isolated from the start, you're the city lockdown. Perth, a guard, isolated before the lockdown, no one else infected. The lockdown was useless.
Yeah, and locking down, we saw the Avalon cluster and so on over Christmas in Sydney, and they locked down a small section of the community, which makes far more sense than locking down the entire state. And that seems to have worked, combined with very efficient New South Wales-style contact tracing. And everyone in New South Wales is used to the QR codes and so on. So if you had a situation where, for example, the lockdowns in Brisbane, Queensland, you would expect to see outbreaks along the border, along the Tweed and sort of northern New South Wales, where the lockdown had stopped the virus coming in and it had spread along the New South Wales border. But there's nowhere where the individual states locked down that we've actually seen at that border point the effectiveness of the lockdowns. Now, you would expect that would be the case.
No. And we'll also say, I must say, where this latest cluster, one person, 16 others then getting infected, they're all in very close contact, the kind of people you'd expect you'd have to keep an eye on. What happened to this claim? This was a hyper-infectious virus moving at hyper speed and a wicked and evil, cunning enemy, which is the sort of rhetoric from the Premier that just scares people, I think, stupid, almost literally stupid. But meanwhile, in Holland, I noticed, Rowan, more respect for people's freedom. A Dutch court has turned down its curfew, scrapped it, saying it was too much of an attack on freedom. It's been reinstated pending an appeal from the government, but I thought that was quite heartening.
It is, and I wish we'd seen more of this, the public actually taking to the law courts to question whether these emergencies are genuine emergencies. You just mentioned the hyper mutant strain. We have a word for that on Outsiders, which is hyperbole, which is extreme exaggeration. And so it turned out. I was immediately suspicious of this hyper UK strain, 70% more infective, blah, 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 used to justify all sorts of things, including the UK lockdown. Where were the citizens going, hang on, you have no proof that this is this drastic emergency that you're suggesting. And this is what happened in Holland. They said there is no proof of an emergency here. And, you know, we have the same thing with COVID and with climate change. You have this endless repetition of, oh, it's an emergency, oh, it's an emergency, without the proof being there to justify the extreme reactions. Now, you can say in some countries and some places, like Italy last year, like London recently, yeah, there is an emergency. The hospitals are struggling. But in Holland, they found there was not an emergency, and the courts, or one judge, agreed with them.
Rowan Dean, you are so correct. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.